Hi, I'm Gytha Lodge, and I'm going to be reading the very first chapter of The Fragile Tower today. High Peaks. The day when all Ma's worst fears came true was dazzlingly bright and beautiful. It had snowed heavily during the night, and when Grace went to collect the post, she trod over perfect, crisp whiteness. She squinted out at their quiet street and felt that it had changed somehow with this first proper fall of snow. It seemed to promise something, and Grace felt a faint stirring of excitement in herself at the thought of change. Later, Grace thought that she should have understood the peculiar feeling. She should have read all the little differences today and realised that something terrible was going to happen before anything wonderful had a chance. But how could she have known, really? Ma had woken at 5:30 to reorganise her portfolio, and she was on her third cup of coffee by the time Grace opened the kitchen door and started stamping the snow off her boots. Ma was bent over the kitchen table with the cup in her left hand, making herself frantic notes and sketches with her right. But at least she was dressed now, and she looked elegant and also a little quirky in her slash-necked black top and her big silver necklace, her hair piled up into a mound of curls. Grace had always been proud of Ma's beauty, particularly of her thick, shiny black hair and her huge eyes. But mixed with that was a little bit of envy that she was ashamed of. Grace felt like her brown hair was dull and uninteresting in comparison to Ma's, and her blue-green eyes were a normal sort of shape and size. Where Ma was exotic and striking, Grace was just average-looking. The only thing she really seemed to have picked up from Ma was her height, and after a sudden rush of growth over summer, Grace was now an inch taller than Ma's 5'9". Although accompanying Ma and Dad on hikes and her kickboxing training meant she was fitter than most of her class, she wasn't graceful like Ma. In fact, she generally felt about as far from living up to her name as was possible. Ma looked up as Grace put the mail on the kitchen table. "You remember Benjamin has football tonight? Make sure he wears enough afterwards, and tell Dad to bring a spare coat for him." "Sure." Grace put the kettle onto the stove again. She smiled slightly at a screech and running steps coming from upstairs. She remembered when Dad had first met Ma and moved in, and the unbelievable excitement of having him there to chase around with each morning. Dad's hectic fun had been such a contrast to the way Ma worried about whether the roads were icy or whether Grace might try to walk home with one of her friends. She almost missed the silliness of those mornings, even though it had been Grace who had told Dad, very solemnly, she was too old for that sort of thing once she hit 6 years old and the twins had started joining in too. She looked at Ma today, whose head was bowed over her sketchpad, and as usual felt a little bit like a traitor for wanting to have more fun. She knew how hard it had been for Ma, bringing a child up alone in a foreign country. For almost 4 years it had been the two of them against the world. She understood Ma's worry more than the twins ever could, more than Dad did even. "What time are you leaving?" she asked. 10 minutes, Ma said, glancing up at the clock and then down again. It was only 6:30. It was a 4-hour drive from High Peaks town to New York City, and that was in good conditions. With the snow, it might be almost 5. Ma's all-important meeting with the Diplomat Hotel wasn't until 1, and would probably last no more than an hour, since they'd already seen and approved Ma's plans for the sculpture she was going to create. But for that 1 hour, she would be on the road for most of the day. Grace leaned over for a moment to look at the sketches, but couldn't really find any interest in them. Ma had flung sketch pads, paints and crayons at Grace from an early age in the hope that she would take after her, but Grace had resisted. She found drawing both frustrating and uninteresting, and painting was almost as bad. She only really loved reading, preferably about mystery or the supernatural, that and practicing tarot and tea leaf readings in an effort to divine the future. In fact, out of Grace and the twins, it was only Maggie who seemed to show any particular artistic talent. She loved to ask for coloured crayons and tissue paper and make strange creations. They always had names, these creatures or places, but none that Grace had ever heard of. Maggie would always insist they were real, despite all the evidence to the contrary. "I'll be back for 4:07, Ma said, while she wrote and sketched by turns, and it was the 5th or 6th time she'd told Grace this. "The twins might be hungry, so do them a snack or something, and if Dad isn't at school by 5, call him." "Yes, Ma." The kettle started to whistle, and Grace pulled out the powdered hot chocolate from the cupboard and grabbed a mug off the wooden tree on the counter. "Is your phone charged?" "Yes." Grace poured her drink and turned the stove off, but got no further than that before Maggie and Benjamin thundered down the stairs. Both were flushed from running and laughing, and still wearing pyjamas. Maggie's curly red hair was in a great fuzz around her head, as it always was before she brushed it. "Aren't you two dressed yet?" Ma asked, and from the sound of her voice, they might have done something illegal. "We've got time, Ma." Grace went to put an arm around her mother. "I'll sort them out once you've gone." Ma squeezed her hand gratefully and tried to continue with her notes. "I'm too hungry to get dressed anyway," Benjamin panted, out of breath, and started opening cupboards. "Where's your dad?" Ma asked, closing her notebook in exasperation. "Taking his shower," Maggie said. "He did too much running." Ma sighed and then rushed to stop Benjamin from pulling out 2 cereal boxes. "What are you looking for?" "Chocolate Pop-Tarts," he told her. "You said you bought some." "I did. I just didn't put them in here." Ma reached up to the cupboard over the sink and pulled out a box. "Ah, you're the best," Benjamin said. "Am I toasting it?" "Them? I'm not just having one," Benjamin said. "I'm starving." He grinned at his mother's narrow-eyed look. "Thanks, Ma." Maggie opened Ma's notebook and started to flick through. "Maggie," Grace muttered, and when her sister looked up at her, shook her head, silently. But Ma had already seen and snatched the notebook off her. "Don't fiddle. I need that." "I was just looking at your drawings," Maggie said, and fixed Ma with one of her wide-eyed gazes. Maggie had the most devious way of coming across like a suffering orphan when it suited her, and the expression worked on almost everyone. Almost everyone didn't include Ma. "Sit down and eat your breakfast," Ma told her sternly. "You can look at the drawings later when I get back." Maggie went to sit next to Benjamin, but then complained, "I don't want Pop-Tarts." Ma started to cram her notebook into her handbag and snapped at her. "Well, what do you want then?" "Cheerios, please." "I'll get them," Grace interrupted, and flung cereal and a bowl and spoon at her sister. Ma was muttering something which sounded like it probably started with, "If you were growing up in Russia." Grace wondered whether a Russian childhood could really be as tough as Ma frequently made out, but it was hard to tell, since this was the only reference she ever made to her home country. Maggie grabbed the bowl of cereal and started to shove spoonfuls into her mouth. "Aren't you supposed to say something?" Grace asked her, and prodded her in the side. They're delicious," Maggie said with a grin, and Grace decided that would have to do. She picked up a hot chocolate and the newspaper Ma had brought in and slipped away to the living room. She unfolded the newspaper and was midway through turning to the horoscopes on the back page when she realised that the headlines were about another missing girl. She looked at the smiling blonde girl pictured on the front page, but didn't recognise her. Kelly, who was just 7, had vanished from her garden the day before. 7 years old, she thought, with a cold feeling. Maggie and Benjamin's age. And at Saranac Lake, too. Only 10 miles away this time. This was the second disappearance of a young girl in the last month. The last one had caused Ma to give them a long lecture on stranger danger and never going anywhere alone, which Grace thought pretty silly when they were never allowed to anyway. And then Ma had come to Grace's room late at night to ask her to keep an extra close eye on the twins. As Grace read on about the search parties out combing the mountains, she tuned in and out of the chatter next door. She heard Ma's attempts to persuade the twins that it was time to get dressed, that they didn't need to watch TV, all underscored by Benjamin's non-stop, enthusiastic description of his last night's creative writing assignment. Dad descended from upstairs at around the time that Ma was about to lose her temper, releasing her to finish getting ready, a few minutes later than she had wanted. Ma came in on her way upstairs, and Grace folded the newspaper so the front page was hidden. That kind of trick rarely worked on Ma, but she was too worked up about the trip to notice. "I'll see you this evening, okay?" she said, hugging her as if she was about to cross the Atlantic instead of the state. Grace hugged her back. "Have a good trip." Ma went to the door but then hesitated, her brow drawn into a frown. "Maybe I shouldn't go," she said quietly, and Grace stared at her. "Ma, it's the most important meeting you've ever had," she said in disbelief. I know, but Dad doesn't know where to go and he's so forgetful." "We'll be fine, Ma," Grace said. Then more firmly, "Really?" Ma stood for a long time, staring into space. "You'll be careful?" she asked quietly. "You'll make sure they're okay? Keep Benjamin in check?" Grace nodded, trying not to get irritated. At last, Ma nodded and walked slowly away. Grace listened to the front door shut with relief. She loved Ma like crazy, but it was easier dealing with a hyperactive Maggie than Ma when she was wound up. Dad poked his head around the door a few minutes later, his hair looking almost dark where it was still wet. "Have you had breakfast?" he asked. "Not yet." Benjamin's chocolate-specked face appeared around the door next, a little lower down. "Hey, we could have waffles." "You want waffles, Gracie? We could put M&Ms in all the squares." Grace grinned at him. "You bet." Dad and Benjamin retreated to the kitchen, and when Grace came through a short while later, it was to see Benjamin attempting to eat a chocolate-covered waffle after finishing his 2 Pop-Tarts, and then complaining that he felt sick. Dad looked over at Grace as he flipped a waffle out of the iron and onto a plate, and rolled his eyes. "If you were growing up in Russia," he said, in a wonderful imitation of Ma, "you'd have been beaten with a strap by now." Maggie and Benjamin chorused in response, and Grace couldn't help laughing, even though part of her felt like a traitor.